moderate and throw those questions out. All right, to you guys. I'd like to go.
I can start us off. We're doing introductions. Okay, yeah. My name is Becca. I use she, her pronouns. I work at UC Berkeley, where I'm the Collegiate Recovery Program Coordinator. I was in last year's Safe Leadership cohort. I think everyone is familiar what a Collegiate Recovery Program does, but I run the day-to-day operations and I'm building a recovery program here for students at Berkeley. And I'll turn it over to Illinois.
Aloha mai kako, Illinois ko hikawa ko inoa no hilo no piho noa maya. Hello, my name is Illinois. I am from Hilo on Hawaii Island in Hawaii. I was in the cohort like 2 years ago. I was able to be a part of the last year's CRLA as a working group leader. And this year I've been fortunate to be a mentor to our Hawaii-based students. And currently I work for Papo'olalokahi, which is the Native Hawaiian Health Board. And my position focuses on cultural approaches in addictions, behavioral health, and social justice. And I'll pass it to Jack.
Hey y'all, my name is Jack Aaron. I use they, them pronouns. I was also part of the cohort 2 years ago. So when COVID hit halfway through. Currently, I live out in Colorado, about an hour west of Denver, up in the mountains. And I run an organization called Rocky Mountain Sex Worker Coalition. I handle all of our direct services. So doing street outreach for people kind of at the intersection between like survival-based sex work, being unhoused, drug use, etc. So, you know, working in harm reduction, essentially.
All right. Well, I think one of the first questions we had to ask was, what types of barriers prevent students from seeking out and or accessing recovery support on campus? Did you want to lead us off, Becca?
Sure, I wasn't sure the order of which we were speaking. Yeah, I think that just generally, like looking at all students entering recovery spaces is intimidating, especially if you've never accessed recovery in the community before or mutual aid groups or other settings. And then especially when we look at underrepresented groups or students who belong to underrepresented groups on campus, feeling like if they go to the CRP or recovery space, like that nobody will look like them or share the same experiences as them. And then if that's the case, feeling like maybe nobody will understand or have empathy towards those unique experiences or trauma that certain affinity groups possess. And then like other barriers I can think of, like childcare is a real barrier. Something pretty tangible you could do is like you could offer space for allow students to bring their kids. There's financial barriers. I think that most of our services across the board are probably low cost or cost free, but considering that and considering like if you were to offer an activity with your CRP, like would it be accessible to low income folks? And then there's like the physical accessibility of the space. Can students with physical disabilities access the space? Are there stairs? Is there a ramp? Yeah, I think there's a lot of general shame and stigma around substance use still. So just like, it's really difficult to, especially if you like haven't been to treatment or if there are like cultural barriers and a lot of cultural stigma around substance use or mental health, to just come into a space. So it's important to kind of be cognizant of that, even if that isn't your experience. But yeah, I think that can kind of get us started. if anyone wants to add, or we can go in a circle.
Yeah, I totally agree with everything Becca said. I think I would just add one thing that we've noticed in in Hawaii, and I think this is a conversation I've had with many of their Indigenous students or students of color. Sometimes 12-step recovery programs don't necessarily resonate with Indigenous students or in students of color. And so, you know, this kind of clinical or Western recovery spaces, even the word recovery can feel pretty excluding to a large portion of the student population. So that's something that we really try to take into account, because some of those recovery processes really focus on this kind of like individualistic recovery, whereas some of these other cultures are more heavily rooted in a more collective kind of understanding of what healing looks like. So it's really important to kind of focus and see what it is, especially of the making a program that's more like reflective of the student body and the various cultures that are existing within that student body. So taking a look at those individual cultural perceptions of self, because those vary in between different cultures. And if you are at a school that has a kind of melting pot of students, then that's something that you really need to kind of take a look at.
Yeah, I completely agree with everything that's been said so far. I think that there are a lot of like structural barriers to accessing recovery spaces on campuses. But I think that there's a lot of it that's like an internal shame-based as well. Like I think that there's a perception of like, who is recovery for? So like someone who's like, you know, drinking too much or like has a unhealthy relationship with party culture is kind of like, well, you know, recovery isn't for me. Like, I'm not on the street. I'm not addicted to hard drugs. Like, there's this like line that I think a lot of people have of like, what does it take to like earn recovery? Like, how bad does it have to get before you can like really step into one of those spaces? I think that's a part of it. And then I think the other part of it is that there's this like expectation within party culture that you have enough control that you can go hard and you can like push the limits and you can push your boundaries, but you have enough control at the end of the day to like step back on your own when you need to. And going out and seeking help is almost like admitting defeat, or like embarrassing yourself that like you were not strong enough to handle this on your own. And I think that that's also something that holds a lot of people back. This like, you know, self-shame aspect of, you know, feeling like they didn't have enough control to handle things on their own.
Nice. I heard a lot of like stigma as a barrier, but internalized stigma as a barrier as well there. And then how diversity is a lot more than just what we see. It can also apply like the childcare and the physical tangible sides of that as well. Nice. Next up, we have, what can you do as a leader or facilitator to foster a recovery space that feels safe, inclusive, and accessible? Becca.
Okay, sorry, I wasn't sure if you're just like going in the circle again.
I like the order.
Okay. Okay, I can think of like quite a few really tangible things that we do or we've implemented over, I mean, starting out when I was at UC Davis, that I've carried over some of this to Berkeley. One of the things are we set community guidelines that are regularly reviewed by the community and not just set by the leader or facilitator. And I think that one thing in there is a statement about discrimination not being tolerated in our space. Another thing in there are some like guidelines around language, specifically like we say like that we practice person-centered language. So some people might prefer identifying as an alcoholic. Some people might like being called are self-identifying as an addict, and then others might like person in recovery or person with a substance use disorder, but letting people decide how they like to be called, I think is something that we've found to be like a positive experience, because I think a lot of people or some people find like person with a substance use disorder is like clinicalizing. I don't know if that's a word, but like while others might argue like that's the proper language or that's like less stigmatizing than addict, I think that some people find that to be like really clinical language and prefer kind of what they like to be called in like mutual aid settings or whatever. I think another thing that comes to mind is like building trust, I think is really essential with your community. For me, like in my current role as a like professional rather than a student peer, I think that's been like being really transparent and authentic about the limitations to my confidentiality. Like, for example, if a student discloses sexual violence or sexual harassment, I would have to report that to Title IX. So like making sure that there's no surprises and that students understand that up front, or like that I would have to call the police if somebody told me that they had a plan to kill themselves. What else? I think another thing that we do is like normalize the sharing of pronouns, like try not to assume just based on someone how someone presents, what pronouns they use. So either asking or sharing your pronouns first, and then giving people space to make that a norm. Yeah, I think I could probably go on with this for a while, but we can like make this more, open it up.
Yeah, gosh, you pretty much covered most of it. We also create guidelines. We try to remain open, have open communication in the beginning of meetings, especially in a virtual space. You know, it can feel very different. So creating those safe, judgment-free spaces. We definitely preface everything, creating exactly like a level of confidentiality within like everything that happens in the meeting stays here as it would normally, but making sure that communication is set up front if something is disclosed that could harm the student or someone else. We just really encourage people to be their authentic selves. We like to, I mean, in Hawaii, you know, we have aloha, right? So, well, aloha exists everywhere, to be very honest, but that's something that we take very seriously. And so when we react to everyone as we would want to be reacted to, we try to remember what encapsulates aloha, our loving and kindness, being, it encapsulates unity, it encapsulates being kind to one another, entering spaces with humility and no judgment. So all of those things kind of encapsulate aloha, and that is at the core of everything that we do. So we really we also try to include everyone as an active member of the group, whether it's a recovery space or whether it's like a social activity of the recovery group. Or healing group. We actually call them more like healing groups. We try not to use the word recovery, or we'll say like recovery and healing, because we found that recovery is excluding sometimes. So healing, we refer to as a healing journey, because saying I'm in recovery is sometimes excluding. So really trying to make sure that our language is very open and embraces any kind of pathway that any person might be on, no matter where they are in their journey. It's not for us to make any type of judgment on where they are in their journey, and that is a journey that they're going on themselves, and we're just here to support them and what that looks like in providing that support to them. We like to have them be active members, so we'll allow different people to maybe lead meetings, or we will allow people to provide different ideas for different social gatherings, so that they feel like they're a part of things and that they're, you know, they matter. And we found that to be very effective in people feeling more part of the ohana, or the family, our healing family.
Yeah, and I think that I also, like, in addition to everything that you two have said, I think that making like very intentional spaces for newcomers, people who are like, let's say, recovery curious, is really helpful. Because I could definitely see a situation of someone coming in, kind of knowing they have a problem, not really knowing what they want to do with that or what recovery looks like, what options are out there, and sitting down in a meeting with people who have, like, you know, multiple years of recovery, are really solidified in their programs, and kind of throwing their hands up and saying, this is clearly not for me. I have some more stuff to figure out before I can really join this community. So I think operating spaces that are really friendly to people who don't have it figured out, are still kind of coming to terms with what their substance use disorder looks like, and what the options for dealing with that are, right? Whether it is joining a 12-step community or whether it is seeing a therapist or whatever else. So I think having, you know, like, aside from, you know, like doing pronouns, like introducing yourself with pronouns at the beginning of meetings, you know, making sure that all identities are seen and heard, also allowing spaces where people can kind of figure themselves out, but still within community.
Great answers. I heard a lot of inclusion is intentional. It's not something that just happens. You have to think about it every time. And for me, every time I open my mouth, language is very important. Person first and respecting other people and asking a lot of questions. A lot of that self-determination, how people identify and how they choose to identify, and just leaving that space open. We had a question from Jennifer in the chat box. She said, we have our language and there is confidentiality, creating a safe place. However, how do we address a violation? Is the collegiate group, if the collegiate group is not connected to the school's guidelines? So kind of like, how do we deal with infractions? How do we reel it in? Does anybody have a suggestion?
I mean, I think that's where your own group's guidelines come into effect, and Becca kind of touched on that. Having established guidelines for your group specifically, at least I'm assuming that you're talking about a student violation. You know, maybe bringing that student into a space that it's just you and them, reviewing the guidelines and letting them know that that's not, that doesn't create a safe space for everyone in the group. And if they continue to do that, they may not be able to continue to join the group. That would be I think that's what we would do.
Yeah, and I think it really brings into effect what Becca said earlier too, about how there's my role as it was as a peer, and then there's the role when you transfer over into a staff position or an employee or a professional or a paraprofessional. Like, there are rules there and roles. And I think the role induction in the beginning of establishing a program or an introduction to a new member is very important. You know, and there's a social contract involved in joining a group. So that's a very good question. It is. It kind of leads into, we have another one. What are some tangible ways to make newcomers feel welcome, especially if groups or cliques might exist? It's back to Becca.
I think that's something that really stuck out to me is a couple of weeks back, we, at the end of our all recovery meeting, I actually took this format directly from Safe Project that I use every week, but we go around and say one gratitude, and the students are really sweet, and they will a lot of the times be like, this group or this community, and I'm like, y'all, you don't have to say that, and it makes it really uncomfortable for the new person. They're like, I just came here, I don't want to feel obligated to say that I'm grateful for this group. But anyways, that was not the point. So one of the students told me that it really stood out to them that I remembered their name, and I think that's something that can be difficult, especially when you're meeting a lot of new people, but can make a really big difference if you remember someone's name. especially in like a larger group. And then like they come back a second time and you're like, hey, Jack, like it's really great seeing you here. That will make people feel special and remembered and like they matter.
Yeah, I agree again with everything Becca says. One of the things that I found really interesting that stood out to me when we were first building our collegiate recovery program was that in previous years, I guess students had walked in and then walked out. They said when we started having more people in and we greeted them with a smile, we're very inviting. We hug, right? In Hawaii, we hug everyone. That's just like normal when we first see them, and it's very inviting. And that was something different that they hadn't really experienced, I guess, in previous years when walking into that space. And so that kind of brings me back again to the concept of aloha and really providing that caring, that inviting, that the patience with a person, and that humility that you just try to internalize and create and be as inviting as you can, because they, you know, these newcomers worked up the courage to come into that space, and this is their first time. And like Becca said, remembering their name. We also like to, if we have their email, I usually, if I don't see them again, sometimes I'll follow up on email if they did provide that. And sometimes that will lead to them even scheduling one-on-one time, which they also gets them to be more comfortable with the groups. So, you know, anything that we can do, everyone that is affiliated with our student peer group is very, very caring and always tries to go the extra mile to reach out to each student. And so I really do appreciate that about them.
Yeah, and I think I would mostly focus on the second half of that question, where you mentioned clicks. I think that that's the part that can't be top down. Like, there's only so much that like the leaders of a collegiate recovery program can do to make everybody feel invited and like, you know, not really have cliques form. I think a lot of that is about like empowering members of the CRC or of the CRP to kind of like do that work themselves. So like I can remember like one of the treatment programs that I was in, like whenever there was a new person who was joining, right? Because it's like people are kind of constantly coming and going from the group. There was almost like a kind of mentorship aspect where someone who had been like a member of the group for a while was kind of assigned like showing the new person the ropes. I think that within CRCs that can kind of be replicated. Like if instead of the staff member in charge of running the program, if instead that responsibility of kind of going over community guidelines or, you know, giving people a tour of the space could be, you know, thrown onto one of the members. Because that not only gives the newcomer like a sense that they have like now a personal connection with someone in the group, but then also gives that member of the group like some ownership in making sure that they feel welcomed and have a good experience when they do start coming to meetings. Yeah, I think it's mostly about like providing opportunities for newcomers to get more like naturally integrated within the group, as opposed to just like kind of shoved into the middle of it. Hey, this is a person you have to accept now. Can sometimes feel disingenuous.
All right. There's some good points there. Like, excellent. What I heard a lot of was like that at a certain point, the CRLA or the CRCs, they're supposed to be student led. And the CRLA is a leadership academy. We're supposed to be fostering leaders. So there's really only so much, like you said, top-down inclusivity that can happen. But now that we're talking about cliques, I want to bring up the next one. This is a big question. This has come up a lot lately, especially this cohort this year. Here we go. Some would argue that allowing students who do not practice abstinence can pose a safety risk for other students in the recovery community. How would you respond to that? And how do we create safe spaces for students from varying recovery pathways?
This is something that we have dealt with or like had conflict with very recently at our CRP. The CRP is harm reductionist in that like abstinence isn't the main goal for everyone in the program, and like we have all recovery meetings, and then students who practice harm reduction are welcome to come to our other main meeting is a rotating recovery meeting. So we rotate between 12-step and non-12-step programs. But something that came up recently was a couple of students who are practicing harm reduction. We're talking like very explicitly and graphically about substance use in a way that I felt like could be triggering to students practicing abstinence. And like I'm a person in recovery and I practice abstinence. So it's like I can sense that this could be upsetting to people. And also a student let me know that it was triggering to them, and it's triggering or upsetting one person, and they are able to speak up about that. It's probably upsetting more people who don't feel comfortable saying something or making that concern, making others aware of that concern. So something that I did was brought up that concern to the group about like how in detail we go about substance use, and like holding a community conversation about that. But that was like a difficult decision to make because I felt like it was about kind of like weighing risk and weighing kind of like the harm that was occurring. Like there's the person who's using and like needing a safe space, and then there's others who are accessing the space who are being triggered. And so kind of like wanting to make sure that like the people who were sharing really graphically about their substance use weren't going to feel like this isn't a space where I can go to like get support, and feel like if we had a conversation about maybe like changing language, like that they didn't feel like they were being shut out of the space, if that makes sense. I feel like I'm getting like a little bit rambly, but yeah, I feel like this can be like difficult to manage and can get really tricky. But I think that overall, like having students practicing abstinence, practicing harm reduction, and like practicing all different recovery pathways in one space is overall like a lot more, is really beneficial, and that like they can learn from each other and guide each other in different directions. And like I think that students in like 12-step programs who that's their main jam have become like a lot more open-minded and like have been able to see, you know, like different benefits of different ways of practicing recovery. And then maybe some students who use really problematically or really heavily have been able to like move along and like not necessarily like towards abstinence, like that's now their goal, and like if it is, it's fine, if not, but like move in a direction of like being more safe. Yeah.
To be perfectly honest, we're fortunate to not have had this issue come up as of yet. So we're very intentional about the openness of our meetings and the openness of of the journey for those that come into our meetings. That's not saying that this won't come up, because I'm actually glad you brought it up, and I wrote down some notes to talk with our students about potentially adding some language into our agreement, our like community agreement about not sensationalizing that language. I think the only thing that we currently have in is just we ask for students to, our events are substance free. So they're asked to not come to meetings or come to the events while on substances. And that's pretty much the only language that we have pertaining to that, since we do, you know, just kind of have an open policy for joining our groups and things it's the journey. But I'm really glad that you brought that up, because I'm definitely going to bring that up with our students.
I'm not sure which one of y'all typed out this question, but thank you for it, because I'm stoked about it. So a little bit about me, self-disclosure. So I was a part of like super traditional, strict, like 12-step abstinence-based program for a little over 2 years. And for about the same, or actually for I guess about 3 years now, I've been following a not strictly abstinence-based program, but still very much so identify as a person in recovery. So I think first off, if you have a person in your collegiate recovery community who's like showing up to meetings and smoking crack in the bathroom, well, clearly that person does not have very good boundaries around their substance use, and you probably need to talk to them about that, right? Because non-abstinence-based form of recovery is all about setting boundaries around your substance use, right? When you do it, how you do it, why you're doing it, etc. So I think that making space for people who are not strictly abstinence-based, right? It allows for conversations about what drug use can look like and why it's being done, which can be really helpful for a lot of people. But I think more than that, it's really important to include people who are not strictly abstinence-based. There are a lot of recovery spaces out there for people who are abstinence-based. AA meetings, NA meetings are all over the place. SMART meetings, not quite as like widely out there, but you can find them. There are not organized recovery spaces for people who do not want abstinence. They just unfortunately do not exist outside of college campuses. So unfortunately, if your program is not welcoming to those modalities, you're turning away people who need support, who have nowhere else to turn. So whatever boundaries your community decides needs to be made, right? Whether it's about language or about showing up to spaces sober, how you talk about boundaries around substance use, like whatever guidelines your community feels like they need, it still needs to be a welcoming space for people who are not in abstinence-based recovery. Because those conversations do happen in the outside world, outside of college campuses. And people who do not want to be sober, like entirely, don't really have those spaces. And especially on college campuses, you're frankly going to have a lot more people who are approaching your collegiate recovery community saying, hey, my substance use is starting to look concerning. I'm having these problems with it. I'm not sure that I need to go to a program and never use a single drug for the rest of my life. You're going to have a lot more people on college campuses who are in that gray area of feeling like they clearly need to make a change, and that change does not need to be abstinence sponsorship 12 steps forever. If you don't make that space, if you don't make space for that gray area, you're casting out a lot of people who unfortunately are probably not going to be able to make those changes. Yeah, I feel like I rambled a little bit, but yeah, it's basically setting the boundaries that you feel like you need to keep the rest of your community safe. But also understanding that someone whose recovery is not based in abstinence is just as valid as everybody else's, and space still needs to be made for them if you do actually want to enable recovery on campus.
Nice. I don't think it's possible to answer that question without rambling. I think everybody, because Dylan and I have this conversation at least once a week, and it's an ever evolving renegotiation of every group. But I mean, there were some really excellent points made. I mean, like on the one hand, there's an urge to try to rescue people when triggering things are occurring. And then on the other hand, there's an empowering people to set their own boundaries. And I really like that statement that non-abstinent based recovery is about setting boundaries around my substance use. Well, isn't life and learning to negotiate life about setting boundaries around myself and my decisions and things like that? So, I mean, it's a very sensitive topic, and that's why it's in here. And also, it's true. This is higher education, and CRCs take place on college campuses where, it's a meeting of the minds from all different backgrounds and all different walks of life. So we have these more like recovery plus conversations. And it's really interesting. So I think we're going to add that into every webinar just to slip people up. And speaking of slip ups, the next question here is great because I do this all the time. Can you share about a misstep or a mistake you've made in the past as it relates to inclusivity and what steps you took to course correct? So.
Sure, I can start. One of my students who uses they, them pronouns and identifies as non-binary, I misgendered like right in front of them. And this was something that I immediately realized I did, and something that I felt like a lot of guilt about. And I was like, I have to correct it in like the right way. That's perfect. But really, I just like said, I'm sorry. And like acknowledged that I like realized my mistake and didn't make like a gigantic deal of it in a way like that would make them uncomfortable. And then we just moved on. And then another similar kind of thing I can think of is like, I don't know, I have a lot of students in my program who identify as non-binary, students who use they, them pronouns, and the other students all tend to misgender each other like all the time. So just like trying to set better norms around that, and like for example, we're having a game night and like everyone's yelling out like each other's pronouns wrong. So just like, hey, can we go around and remind each other like our names and pronouns? But yeah, managing that is the first thing that comes to mind, but I'm sure I've made like plenty of mistakes. Yeah, and I'm just like always continuing to try and do better.
Go ahead, Jack, I'm still thinking.
Well, on the spot here. Yeah, kind of dovetailing off what I was just talking about. I think I've, at different times, kind of taken what I was saying and brought it a little bit too far. Where the Collegiate Recovery program that I was formerly a part of was like very much so focused on abstinence, like to the point where it oftentimes did not really feel like a safe place for me. But there were a lot of times where we'd have a newcomer come in, didn't really know the first thing about recovery, didn't know where they stood, what they wanted, etc. And I would oftentimes like try and reach out to them and sort of give them the message like, hey, you're going to have like a lot of people who are telling you to like seek abstinence and all of this. Just to let you know, there are other options out there for you. Here are all the ways that recovery can look like. I think I've sometimes taken that too far and like maybe crossed into the line of like shit talking AA a little bit, which was like, not necessarily my intention, but like can definitely see how it would have come off like that. Yeah, so I think that in general, just like being careful with your own biases and like not pushing your way of doing things too far.
Okay, thank you. That helped me. Yeah, on that note, then, also, I think what I was kind of thinking of is, I guess in what I do, it's very culturally oriented. So I find myself often then pushing culture onto people when they might not necessarily be ready for it yet. So really tried to take a step back and really listen to where people are at. And what I found And actually this ties back to the harm reduction question too, because we've been doing a lot of work in relation to like a cultural or native Hawaiian lens of harm reduction, and realizing that it is a part of a lot of cultures is to be accepting and open at the very base of the culture. It's who we are, right? We are filled with love and connection for one another. And so sometimes I have confused that with pushing culture onto people that are not ready yet for the culture, and instead of listening to where they're at and helping to connect the concepts at their base. And so, yeah.
Nice. Great point. I was taking notes here. I can say that if I misgender someone, I was always informed to say thank you when corrected and not sorry. Thank you, and then correct, and then course correct. Something we've started doing in social work is in my progress notes, in my documentation, we don't even use gender pronouns. Everyone is they. It's easier that way. And then and then in groups and such, like on campus, to have everyone announce their pronoun, because it is othering if only certain people have to announce pronouns. I like what you said, Jack, about the pushing the non-abstinence based maybe a little too far sometimes. I've been accused at tabling events at shouting out our medical amnesty policy to freshman students in such a way that I might be encouraging them to get drunk underage, because you can call 911 and you won't get kicked out of school because we have medical HB 595, House Bill 595, and parents sometimes look at me strange. I just want to, I think we had a webinar on this a couple weeks ago that was like balancing the advocacy motive and the community motive at the same time, which every CRC is a little bit advocacy, at least, because we're making a statement, a stand on campus. So, yeah, and a lot of advocacy. I remember, I think it's a quote from the Harm Reduction Coalition. It says, it's impossible to support people in recovery without also supporting people who use drugs, because the policies aren't geared against the people in recovery. They're geared against people using drugs. So these are great answers, and these are sticky questions. So you guys are rolling with it. We had some comments come in while you were sharing. Michelle Papania from FAU, she noted the importance of meeting people where they are, meeting people and not assuming, a lot of people, depending on which recovery pathway I've been indoctrinated in, that's my lens. That's what I look through. So it's always important to not only recognize bias, but to sometimes work against it. Because I'm not going to think about that newcomer that has no idea what's recovery, what's healing. Like the disease model has so many pros, but it has so many cons also. So, and then Cheryl would like to say, thank you for your insight and answers to these questions. Any ideas on how to strengthen a program that is at a community college, which is still not 100% back on campus, for students this coming fall? We offer Zoom meetings with our live meetings, but no one comes. Ideas for outreach. This, I think everybody in this group has experience with this one. And that's inclusivity there too. Over to you, Becca.
Sure. I think that I haven't found like general tabling to be super helpful, but I do think that like doing things in person on campus would be helpful if that's an option, and just getting out there. If you have a few people who are invested in working on outreach and promotion, maybe doing some sort of event that's really inclusive and open to all, so people can kind of come and like get a taste, and it's not like, if I go to this thing, then I'm identifying myself as a person in recovery or someone who struggles with drug use or whatever. I also think that like building a relationship with clinicians or AOD specialists, if there's AOD specialists on your campus, could be helpful, and they can help you promote. Yeah, those are two good places to start.
I agree with Becca. Tabling, I have not found to be useful. As of yet, so far. So what we usually do is we actually do presentations in different classes, and we'll usually try to go for like associated fields like social work, public health, if there's an addictions specialization or something within your campus. We have newsletters that we send out. We'll actually have the students do the presentations in the classroom because it's usually a student-led initiative, and seeing your peer give that kind of a presentation is a little bit more helpful for getting students to come. We'll send our newsletter out to we'll just like pull up the directory for the school and just randomly send it to like the trio. Is it called trio everywhere? It's like non-traditional students. We'll send it to like those offices. We'll just anyone we can, counseling offices, the different admin assistants for the different departments, so that they can forward the notices out to their school, to their departments. Yeah, that's all I can think of right now.
So from the position that I'm speaking, it's going to be kind of ironic, but let's be real now. No one wants to go to a Zoom meeting at this point. We're over 2 years into this. I think a lot of people are kind of sick and tired and fed up with speaking to like postage stamp size faces on their computer. Like, that is unfortunately just the reality of where we're at. That said, fortunately, being together outside at this point is just medically safe. Like, if you look at the scientific data, there is very little risk in being together outdoors, especially if you are distanced. So I think that setting up get-togethers where you can be together outside, right? Whether it's picnics in parks, or whether it's going on hikes, or meeting up at a restaurant and going out for dinner. I think it's a mistake to think that the only thing that your recovery community can do is host recovery meetings. You know, fellowship and like recreation is also a piece of that. So yeah, if your program has some kind of mailing list, or whether they have some kind of mailing list or Slack group or GroupMe group or whatever else, posting opportunities to like get together and do things is helpful. You know, it helps like people actually like want to be engaged in the recovery community because it comes along with something fun. But then also, yeah, totally having non-traditional students, or the counseling center, or other facets on campus who know about your collegiate recovery community and can kind of refer students to it would also be helpful. But yeah, I think that just broadening your idea of what engagement can look like beyond just meetings will help people actually like want to feel like they actively want to be a part of.
I have one more thing to add. Maybe try a different kind of meeting too. Just as Jack was talking, I was thinking about that, a different kind of gathering, not just outside, but like almost like a different topic. And this example is going to be very culturally specific. We did this here. We focused on cultural, our mythological stories, and we invited different speakers. So we held different webinars because this was during COVID, right? So we had 2 a month. We invited very respected cultural practitioners to share these mythological stories. And then we held space afterwards to dive into what these stories meant to healing for our people. And so these kind of spaces, really a lot of stuff came up for our students during these times, and students that wouldn't normally come to recovery or healing meetings like that, they would come to these spaces and start to unpack some of the trauma in their lives. And it was really meaningful. And then it led to them wanting to continue conversations like that. So we would have a follow-up. The following week, our peer meeting would be focused on that topic of whatever our meeting had left off from our previous webinar. So whatever. So it's like figuring out what the medicine is for your student population, and then bringing that medicine to them is a good way to kind of spark that so they can start to unpack. We really view like substance use as a symptom of a much larger trauma amongst our people. And this is very similar for a lot of those who persons who find themselves using. So, that's that finding that medicine that we can all kind of come together and start to unpack the why of it.
Again, I like great answers. This more expansive approach to things, getting outside of that recovery box. This is what we do. This is what we do. And saying that, there's more to it than that. And I mean, I've experienced the same thing. Recruitment is very difficult at FAU as far as engagement in meetings, because the area is so saturated in so many meetings of different pathways. But I mean, we get a big response when we go into those like political action things, the Narcan distributions, the harm reduction pushing. Some people like to get it, but at the same time, not pushing people into advocacy. I really liked Lilino's point about having these educational opportunities, these webinars or these discussions, because we have a lot of people show up today because they want to learn. This was an interesting topic, but it's student-led. Because what are we talking about? Empowering students, like creating, not empowering, they have the power, creating an empowered space. So, I mean, that was excellent. And Cheryl commented here, thank you for your ideas. It helped reinforce we are headed in the right direction. We are really focusing on fun things starting in the fall and rebuilding community at the community college for everyone. Thank you. Fun's very important. And then timing's everything too. Like, don't try to throw off an event during finals. And sometimes, sometimes everything else is going on. So really listening to students. And then here's Hannah. She's popping back on because she had something important to say. No, I'm just kidding. Did anybody else want to jump in with anything? Any last minute, like, takeaways or anything? Because I can talk all night.
Yeah, I have something. We have to work on making recovery appealing. If we don't reset the message that recovery is just like some bummer that you have to go through when you get your 6th DUI and you're going to end up dead if you don't go to this meeting, no one's going to come. Recovery communities actually have to be communities, right? Where fun and enjoyable things happen, right? That are actually appealing to go to. And I think that's just whether on campus or just in the broader world, just a point of messaging that we all have to frankly get a little bit better at. Understanding that recovery can actually make your life better and can make your life more fun. It's not just about covering for things that you screwed up on. But yeah, making recovery something that's appealing to run towards, as opposed to just the thing that you do to run away from addiction.
All right. Well, this was an awesome webinar. I've been doing this work for 4 years, and every time I listen in on anything our students have to say, I continue to learn more, which is awesome. So thanks everybody for joining tonight. I am going to go ahead and just throw a quick, literally 1-minute survey in the chat. If you could quickly fill that out, that really does help us come up with topics for future webinars and just future content, and also just gauge how we're doing with our webinar. So please be sure to do that. Also, we are, like I mentioned earlier in this webinar, we are going to be starting, or the application is going to be open for the next CRLA, Collegiate Recovery Leadership Academy cohort, in just a little over a month. So I know we have some staff members on this call. If you do have any students, or if you don't have any students yet, still share the opportunity, because that might be a way, that is actually a great way to do outreach, because the Leadership Academy really is an awesome opportunity. So keep an eye on our social media and also on our newsletter that we send out. If you're not on that, just hop on our website and you can join our newsletter. We definitely send out a lot of opportunities via that avenue. Thank you, Becca, Jack, and Lilinoy. You all are wonderful. This has been such a great conversation. And a conversation that I am just so happy that we're having. This has been a lot of the stuff that we talked about tonight, even though it seems like kind of common sense, you know, let's honor people, and let's, regardless of what their background is and where they're coming to us from, like, let's treat them all the same. You know, that seems like a rule of thumb that we all learn in kindergarten, but somewhere along the way that has gotten lost. And especially in the collegiate recovery space, there has been one way to do things for a very long time. And these conversations are starting to change that. So thanks for being a part. We're really excited that you are here tonight. If you have any questions or want any of the panelists' contact information, I'm sure they'd be more than willing to share that. So just shoot me an email. I'll throw that in the chat as well. Have a great night, everybody.